Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar coming to you from the Lahore studios. And today, once again, in this episode of Newswire, we will be bringing you the latest of what is unfolding in Indian-occupied Kashmir. It has been 63 days since the Indian government revoked Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, the clause that gave Jammu and Kashmir a special status that guaranteed the special rights to the Muslim majority state, including the right to its own constitution, autonomy to make laws on all matters except, of course, defense and communications and foreign affairs. And throughout this time, the communication blackout has not eased. Thousands have been detained, the whereabouts of whom are unknown to their family and loved ones. Hundreds have been injured and hospitalized after falling victim to brutal attacks by over 1 million Indian troops stationed there to watch closely a population of only 8 million Kashmiris. And of course, there are detentions and there are house arrests of journalists and senior local political leadership that does not reflect even a hint of normalcy in the region that the BJP-led government claims to have. So just 2 days ago, Indian activists and a US senator were blocked from visiting the Indian-occupied Kashmir. The US senator, Mr. Chris Van Hollen, was traveling there to observe essentially the situation on the ground, what the humanitarian situation is, as US has been watching closely the situation in Jammu and Kashmir and has even urged the Modi's government to ease the restrictions imposed on Kashmiris. So we will be asking our guests today where they think the situation is headed with the latest developments. Let me introduce our experts who will be speaking to us. With us, we have Pakistan's permanent representative to the United Nations, Mr. Munir Akram. He's joining us from New York. And we also have international relations expert and director of the School of Politics and International Relations of Quaid-e-Azam University here in Islamabad, Dr. Nazir Hussain is also joining us. I'd like to welcome both of you for taking out the time and speaking to us here on Newswire. Mr. Munir Akram, if we can start with you of the latest developments, especially in light of the US Senator and after his visit to Pakistan, his comments on how there is a grave concern, more so, and the suspicions he feels that the humanitarian crisis is real there in Jammu and Kashmir. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what the senator has encountered is a confirmation of what we have seen for the last 60 days in occupied Kashmir, which is a total lockdown, curfew, complete blackout. The Indians have been going around saying things are returning to normal, but it's absolutely clear that nothing is returning to normal. It's still the same clampdown that is happening. This is what they're trying to hide. So it confirms what we've been saying and what the world has confirmed in so many ways. And this is the latest confirmation, if one can see it as that.
So, Dr. Nazir Hussain, while Mr. feels that this is a confirmation of what Pakistan at least has been trying to highlight in terms of the kind of humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in what is the third month of the lockdown. In your opinion, do you think that what the recent state of events are with the US Senator are they going to have an impact really on the global scale of this current narrative that Indian government has, that all is well?
I think, Ms. Ayza, slowly and gradually, the international community and international states, the bodies, INGOs are coming to the realization that the Indian government act in IOK, that is Indian occupied Kashmir, is unjust, inhuman, and against the even basic humanitarian law. Mm-hmm. So we are glad that this issue has been now highlighted not only by the local media but international channels. Mm-hmm. And you must be knowing this, that probably in the US Congress there is going to be a clause in the bill which is going to be passed by the US Congress, whereby they are requesting or impinging upon the Indian government to repel this uncalled for curfew, which is, as you say, 64th day or the third month has entered. So I think this is a realization on the part of international community and the bearing of not only the US Senator, But I think the fact-finding missions, journalists, Mr. Sinha, Rahul Gandhi, so many people have been denied an access, which exposes the Indian brutality and Indian action, which they are trying to prove to the world that there are just a few people who are pinching upon and trying to undo this. But in fact, I think this is a reality which is dawning upon the international community. And I think this bearing of Mr. U.S. Senator is a sign that India is going to cannot hide for much longer the plight of the inhumanity, unjust, which is prevailing in our IOK for the last 64 days.
Yet at the same time, Mr. Munir Akram, to you, there is a huge concern that while it is all, it's a big improvement that Kashmir has finally come back to the forefront of the international attention. But at the same time, after the United Nations General Assembly speech of Prime Minister Imran Khan, after that furor has gone down, do you feel like the conversation there at the UNG is still going on? It is still alive, the concerns for Kashmir?
Well, I think we have to keep it alive. This is our issue. This is our priority. And therefore, it is incumbent on us to keep it alive. The Prime Minister has done so in a dramatic way at the General Assembly, and that has brought the attention of the world to this issue. And it is up to us to sustain that interest, sustain that attention. And I think to quite some extent we are succeeding in doing so. But we will have to continue through the United Nations, through the General Assembly and its committees, in the U.S. Congress, in Europe, and in other capitals which are relevant to the consideration of the Kashmir issue, especially in the Security Council. We will have to keep this alive and sustain a diplomatic campaign to keep it alive. And it is only through such a sustained effort that we will get the necessary results. This is not a one-day operation in diplomacy. This is going to be a process and a sustained process, and we will need the stamina, the determination, and the conviction to sustain it in the coming months.
Now, while that's a really good point, Dr. Munir Akram, of how this is not going to be an overnight operation, and we're already seeing this conversation still alive and well, at least at the UN, at least with international leaders. But the question really is, Dr. Nazir Hussain, is this going to go on for the sake of Kashmiris? I mean, just Saturday, a grenade blast injured at least 10 people in Anantnag in Jammu and Kashmir. And the Director General of the police said that the explosion was set off by a militant attack. Whether militant or not, the kind of uprise we are seeing, as little as we know about it because of the curfew, is there a huge concern that things are getting bad very quickly there?
Yes, Ayza, you are absolutely right in that particular case. But let me say three things very quickly. One, as Mr. Munir Akram, people like him, a very seasoned and experienced person at the UN headquarters, can impress upon the 5 permanent members as well as the other UN Security Council members as a sustained effort. But I think two other aspects has to be highlighted. One is the role of the diaspora, which are living all around the world, especially in Europe. They has to be mobilized. And second and thirdly, the true leadership of the Kashmir has to go out to impress upon the people that this issue, first, is an humanitarian crisis, second is a state issue, and thirdly, it's an issue which can jeopardize the entire peace and stability of South Asia. But having said this, as you mentioned your case and the issue you highlighted, there are two fears. As a Pakistani, as a human being, I have two fears, very great fears, that India can somehow turn the table on by doing these sort of acts where violence is being created and let the Kashmiris to retaliate. And the example you mentioned is the grenade attack, that, okay, now the terrorist has come and this. And So that India can tell the table. That is where you people like the media has to be very pinpointed, very objectively reporting things, and not to pin upon that these issues have been highlighted by the people of Kashmir. But the second thing, it is most important, that the sustenance and the preservance of the patience which the Kashmiris have so far shown in the Indian occupied Kashmir at large is a manifestation that there is a storm coming, and the silence is there, but a storm is coming. And lastly, as you know very well, that despite this curfew, very tense curfew, for the last many days, the people have been coming out, okay, in small quantity, 50, 100, 200, and especially the Jummah congregation has been used as a symbol of resistance, Kashmiris' sustained resistance against the Indian occupied Kashmir.
Right. Now, this is a point that Mr. Munir Akram highlighted, 2 points actually that Dr. Nazir Hussain has talked about. One, about the leadership of Kashmir, of Jammu and Kashmir, that is right now either behind bars, unknown whereabouts, or in house arrest. Is this a conversation that is taking place within those in the UN who could do something about it, could raise the attention, at least from your side, from Pakistan's side? Is this coming up as a concern?
Well, I think you must have seen the statement that was issued by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva during the Human Rights Council, and that was very clear. And I think that this was made clear in the European Union statement in the Human Rights Council. This has been stated by the 50-plus countries which joined Pakistan in a joint statement in the Human Rights Council. And this is also one of the reasons, the detention, the curfew, the blackout, the human rights concerns, the concerns about war between Pakistan and India being provoked by a false flag or operation or a terrorist attack. These are all the concerns that were relevant to the Security Council taking up this issue after 50 years. We took courage in both hands, and we went to the Security Council and asked for its consideration, and the Council unanimously agreed to consider this issue in informal consultations.
But that is on the front of the civilians in general, right, Mr. Munir Akram? But in terms of the political leadership, of the local leadership, even when they are renowned or known to be pro-Indian, whether we're talking about the People's Democratic Party chief, Mehbooba Mufti, who has in tweets that are being handled by her daughter now, have been very vocal about this criticism, that voice of a democratic sort of system being completely eliminated by a country that has been boasting and calling itself the largest democracy of the world. That conversation, it seems, is that a highlight? Is that a concern? Has that been reached out to the Indian government?
Well, you know, I've had doubts about Indian democracy, so-called democracy, for many years. It's a hypocrisy more than a democracy, and it's showing its real face now. Therefore, I think the Kashmiri leadership obviously is behind bars. We don't know when they'll get out. But the struggle is going to be led by the people. When the people are allowed to come out, it is their anger, their spirit, which is going to dictate the direction of this struggle, because the leadership is in jail and they are not able to lead. New leaders will emerge from the people.
Right. And just that also, Dr. Nazir Hussain, to talk about how this indigenous movement, this sort of pressure cooker environment where situation is getting tense and more tense. There was a report recently over the weekend written by an all-women fact-finding mission to Kashmir that went from New Delhi, and they reported that as many as 13,000 youth have been picked up by the Indian security forces in the state during this ongoing government crackdown. And the situation on the ground is right now unprecedented. Shops are closed. And here I want to actually quote something that one of the activists as part of this delegation said. She said, and this is activist Annie Raja, she said, and I quote, "It is an Indian variant of genocide, and the army cannot remain as a holy cow anymore." What are your thoughts on this?
I think the fact-finding mission of these 5 activists was a revealing episode of the Indian hypocrisy and Indian double standards, but they profess at the one hand and the practice of the other hand. And I think, like other reports, this report also must be highlighted at the international fora, and especially to the concerns of the human rights bodies, one of which Mr. Munir Akram referred. But I think generally in Europe and in North America, this has to be highlighted more. 30,000 to 40,000 RSS people under the guise of the paramilitary forces, under the guise of the police, have been in Kashmir, and they are doing anything possible. And I heard one of the interviews of the Indian chiefs saying that we would do anything to suppress the voice of the Kashmiris, not to say the actions of the Kashmiris. I think these things have to be highlighted.
Thank you so much, Nazir Hussain, joining us there, giving us his time and talking about the situation, highlighting very important points here, Mr. Munir Akram. But do you agree here that this the side of the conversation where this extremist side of the Indian government, the RSS-led movement of subjugating Muslims, a minority all across India, not just in Indian-occupied Kashmir, do you feel like in the UN General Assembly that this wasn't highlighted enough, keeping in mind that not only did Prime Minister Imran Khan brought it up, but also the Malaysian leadership brought it up in terms of this being a complete sort of a reflection of how Hitler used to operate against the Jews in Germany?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's statement was as revealing and as frank and as informative and as strong as has ever been heard at the United Nations. The United Nations, after all, is a diplomatic forum, and people couch their speeches in nice language. But the Prime Minister spoke as strongly as possible. Right. Now, it is obviously up to us collectively, as Pakistanis, as Kashmiris, it is up to us collectively to express and convey what is happening all across the world, not only at the United Nations, but as Dr. Nazir Ahmed has said, through the diaspora, in parliament, in capitals, in the media, in the social media. This has to be a concerted and comprehensive campaign that we have to launch, and the results will be slow in coming. We must realize that. It will not be instantaneous. It's a campaign. It's a diplomatic campaign. The Rohingya, first resolution on the Rohingyas took 13 months to come in any international forum. During the crisis in East Pakistan, India was never able to get a resolution against Pakistan. Until the when the war took place. So let's keep it in perspective, but we have to sustain this pressure on India so that it will not exacerbate the situation or become so desperate as to go to war with Pakistan. These are the two dangers.
These two dangers are pretty much up there in terms of concerns when it comes to Indian-occupied Kashmir and how the BJP-led government is behaving. But here, let me also get another voice in, another guest who is joining us. We have with us the chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global, Mr. Zaffar Qureshi. You're a Kashmiri, and right now you're speaking to us from London. Welcome, and thank you for speaking to us here in Newswire. The conversation essentially going on while there is an understanding that the time frame that anybody would have for the sake of residents of Jammu and Kashmir is that it's going to take a while before any action unfolds. But the real question is the kind of response we're seeing from within Jammu and Kashmir. Is there a grave concern that the voice of Kashmiris in this global debate is going unheard?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Akram Saab as well for his new role. Indeed, as you know, you have seen in the media since the blockade and the complete impose of a curfew in Kashmir, there is a grave concern that the people have been currently killed. There's a massive genocide happening in Kashmir. The demography of Kashmir is being changed. And if the world remains silent without taking any proactive action, this may escalate to a nuclear threat, which will not just reside within the Kashmir or between India and Pakistan, but it will be a global concern, which may be too late. So the quicker and the faster that the world responds to these threats, that the fascist government, which seems to be hell-bent on imposing the draconian laws, killing the innocent people. It's a death of the democracy, which we see within the Kashmir as well as India.
Now, let me also get your thoughts on this development, Mrs. Zaffar, what we saw recently in a response to a right to information request, which was filed by an activist in New Delhi in terms of the curfew that is imposed in Indian-occupied Kashmir, the orders to detain civilians. Now, the Home Ministry turned around and said that we at the centre, we have no information on any orders passed to block telecommunications and internet and suspend radio, satellite, television services, etc. To even, they said they had no information to evacuate tourists. Now, this kind of information, this kind of statement that comes across, how does it make you react?
To be honest, for every Kashmiri or any peace-loving citizen who believes in democracy and human rights, freedom of speech, it does make our blood boil. The reality on the grounds are far fresh from what the Indian narrative holds. The 5 women delegation that went to Kashmir, and that wasn't me, that wasn't any Indian-occupied Kashmiri or a Pakistani or international community. It was the Indian Women's Society who went into Kashmir, who looked at the ground realities and provided a clear report on what's happening on the ground. No communication, no medication. People have been arrested. 13,000 young people, as young as 10, 11-year-olds, have been imprisoned without any information. Thousands of families whose lives have been ruined, their children have been picked up during the night, and they've been provided with no information. And then the government comes up with such a statement that they do not have any information.
Right.
If that is the case, why isn't the international media, the international NGOs allowed to go into the ground and actually check for the reality and show what's happening on the ground itself?
Mr. Akram, this very point that Mr. Zaffar has just highlighted, why isn't the international, the objective, the impartial organizations, those who are in charge of observing humanitarian crisis, why are they not allowed? And also to the earlier point of the centre not knowing that such orders were given. I mean, let's not forget that Jammu and Kashmir has been under President's rule since December last year.
Well, the non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, all of them have asked to go to occupied Kashmir. They have applied to go, but they have been refused permission to go in there, just like the U.S. Senator has been refused, and so many others have been refused permission to go into occupied Kashmir. So it's very clear that the Indians want to do their dirty work under the cover of darkness. And darkness is what has descended on occupied Kashmir. We have to keep up the pressure. They have pretended that things are getting better, but well, if they are, they should open the door. We have to keep up the pressure. That's the first step we have to do, is get the blackout, the curfew, and the imposition of these restrictions lifted, so that the Kashmiri people will be able to express their own wishes and their own response to what the Indians have done.
Right. And Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, we are also talking about what the international leadership is doing in terms of continuing this pressure here on Indian government to ease up on these restrictions, and especially after the UNGA session. In your opinion, with your organization working to represent the voices of those in Jammu and Kashmir, do you feel that their accessibility to those on the ground has improved? The situation might have gotten a little better?
Unfortunately, I wish I could agree with, say that it has. We are still facing challenges. We're trying to get in touch with the people on the ground in Kashmir. Few landlines have been opened up, but they're closer to the police stations, which are monitored. So we can't even get any communications through. Where many organizations, many NGOs, the charity organizations have tried to get in, and we are still finding it difficult. As Munir said, the pressure needs to be there, but I think there needs to be a bit more proactive and action, a tangible action, which can enforce India to allow these NGOs to go on the ground and provide respite and relief.
Okay, right. So we're running out of time here, Mr. Munir Akram. If I could quickly get your take, and it's a bit of a huge question. Essentially, you sitting in the position that you are with close access to world leaders, and if we were to only take a look at those standing behind Pakistan on showing concerns of how grave the situation is, can there be any expectation of a more sort of political and economic joint effort by Muslim leaders in order to impose pressure if the UN doesn't take more action?
Yes, I think we have to sustain the pressure at all levels. In the Security Council, in the UN General Assembly, the third committee is the Humanitarian Human Rights Committee. In that committee, at the level of leadership, at the level of the UN Secretariat, which has got humanitarian arms in there, which can act, which can provide humanitarian support. We have to act through the ICRC, the Red Cross, all of these organizations which are concerned with such situations. We have to approach them. We have to keep up the pressure. They have to keep up the pressure on the Indians and reveal what is happening. And that's the first thing that we have to get done. And it is only through international pressure that the Indians will relent.
All right, there we've run time with that. Mr. Munir Akram and Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking to us, giving us your opinion on how the situation in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, what it is like after the UN General Assembly session, where Prime Minister Imran Khan gave a very powerful speech highlighting how the BJP-led government has pushed forward a very right-wing Hindutva agenda. And with that, we've come to the end of this part of the show. Stay tuned for the second story coming up right after this break. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, more than 100 people have been killed and thousands have been injured in protests across Iraq. Iraqi authorities are saying that at least 7 more people were killed in latest clashes between protesters and the police in eastern Baghdad on Sunday. Now, this is bringing up to the death toll to a little over 100 people. Now, the protests have been going on for over a week now throughout the country, and the rising number of civilians dying in these anti-government protests, as they are called, is becoming a bigger concern. Now, what we will be talking about today, essentially, with our guests is not only why these protests are taking place, but also the very timing of these protests and how they are different from those in the past. Now, to understand the tense situation already in the Middle East with the latest happening in Baghdad, let me introduce our guests. We have with us Ms. Belkis Wille, an analyst, a senior analyst joining us from the Human Rights Watch in Beirut. And also we have a journalist from Baghdad giving us an update, Mr. John Hasasu. Mr. Hasasu, if we could begin with us, if you could give us a clarity on the protests taking place. Who are these protesters and what are they demanding?
Yeah, these protests, as you may know, came out casually, and they don't have a specific leadership or a political or religious group that supports or presents them, really. So they came out with some demands that Iraq is very familiar with since the very beginning of the democratic experience here in Iraq. Unfortunately, unemployment, poor management, and corruption was the biggest problem for Iraq and Iraqis. And they were demanding a fair and clean government for a long time. And these demands actually postponed it right after Daesh came out. So the appearance of Daesh and the threat that posed to the Iraqi government and to the whole country postponed these kind of problems and demonstrations. And now, after Iraq deals with Daesh in most of the country, and it's actually win a victory against the terrorist group, now people are again asking for their natural demands to have a country that's ruled better, with a better system, with no corruption, and jobs and other education, electricity. Some basic services are not really properly. They don't have it properly here in Iraq, right. So they are claiming their natural rights. But why these protesters came out suddenly at this specific time? There are a lot of theories behind it, but to put it simply, these groups are basically not motivated by a specific political or religious group, at least so far, and they don't have a shared leadership.
Okay, so I want to come back to you, Mr. Hasasu, to talk a little about the dynamics of this group of youngsters who are protesting in the thousands, actually. But Ms. Wille, I'd like to get your expertise, your opinion on this. Now, the Iraqi government earlier on came out and said they denied essentially that their security forces weren't the one who were firing directly at the protesters during this over 6 days of violent demonstrations. Who do they say is behind the deaths of these 109 civilians?
You know, it's a really good question, and it's not one the government has answered. As you say, they've implied that they were not behind the snipers that different protesters have seen on top of buildings, and are leaving it sort of to anyone's guess as to who these snipers are. That being said, I've spoken to multiple protesters who saw these snipers firing specifically at demonstrators, not at security forces. So it's hard to believe that these snipers have no links to the Iraqi security structure. In addition to that, you know, the number of wounded, the number of dead is extremely high, and it comes in tandem with much testimony that we've gathered in Baghdad and elsewhere in the south that other armed forces not using snipers were repeatedly opening gunfire on protesters in order to disperse crowds. And I've spoken to people who actually witnessed protesters next to them getting shot by this open gunfire.
So as I understand, what you're saying is that those armed and shooting at these protesters, there is no identification of who they are, who they're related to, who they're working for?
Specifically with the snipers that have been reported from buildings, my understanding is that unfortunately we don't know who they're working for because they're not wearing visible uniforms that help identify them. That being said, they are targeting protesters and not security forces, so seem to be linked to the government.
Is linked to the government. And also the government itself is barely finished a year. And already the uproar is huge. There are allegations of huge corruption under the Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi's tenure. Is that the primary concern here with the protesters?
I think that's one of the key concerns. Corruption is perhaps the most common concern that any single Iraqi, doesn't matter where they're from, what religion they're from, or where they live in the country, is most worried about. Right. Corruption completely hampers the ability of the government to meet any of the basic needs and services that citizens deserve.
Right, and also the Transparency International, the international organization gauging each country for on the corruption index, has said that Iraq is on a number 12, and it's nothing new. Is it too premature, or have the people had it and they cannot wait? Like, is this 1 year period of the government being in action, was it long enough to assuage their demands?
I think, you know, the government tried when it formed to pass on a message to the public that it aimed to make a change. It made big, lofty promises to make a change when it came to service provision and when it came to corruption. And while fixing a lot of the gaps that you have in Iraq would take, you know, well over a year, I think people were fed up with yet another government making empty promises. And in the last year, the reality is people haven't seen much improvement. In the south, you still have areas that have practically no electricity, no safe drinking water. And I think, you know, people are saying enough is enough.
Right. Okay, so Mr. Hasasu, coming back to you, Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi's cabinet recently also came out with an emergency meeting, and what did they do, or what efforts have they made to assuage the concerns of the protesters?
Adil Abdul Mahdi and his cabinet thinks that they've done positive things for Iraq and Iraqis since they took office. And he says, like, we don't have a magic stick that we change everything in one night. So we have to be patient, and we're still working towards the positive, he says. But obviously people are not agreeing with the Prime Minister, and there are political parties who were negotiating or agreed to choose Adil Abdul Mahdi as a Prime Minister, and meaningly the biggest list at the Iraqi parliament, which is the Sairun movement. And Sairun movement actually supported by the Iraqi Shi'i leader Muqtada al-Sadr. This party suspended its activities at the parliament, and Muqtada al-Sadr himself called the prime minister to act rapidly or to resign and take the country to a early election. At this point, there is a discussion here between people. People saying are like, the U.S. is not happy with Adil Abdul Mahdi, so they will benefit from any street demonstration and the pressure that it puts on his government. And Iranians are supporting Adil Abdul Mahdi's government and they don't let it to fall. So under all these discussions today, as you may know, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, came and visited the Iraqi capital, and he met his Iraqi counterpart, and he will meet the Iraqi president and some other officials, and he declared his support as well. So at this point, I think, the streets are calmer, and people are waiting for the other main opposition parties and the Sairun movement, which is actually naturally tied to Muqtada al-Sadr, the Shi'i cleric, to really make a statement about what Adil Abdul Mahdi's government promised to the protesters, because Adil Abdul Mahdi came out with some promises, but as I said, most of the people are saying, why didn't they do it since they were in charge of the government for almost 1 year?
But also, Mr. Hasasu, do you feel like there is also any connection with what we saw just last month when an attack on paramilitary forces within Iraq, which were backed by Iranian forces, a responsibility that Israel didn't openly take, but it was understood they were behind those attacks, and this is in line with what happened in Lebanon, what happened across the border in Syria from Israel. So do you feel like that this timing seems to be connected, that these string of events have more in common than meets the eye?
I think it's natural to think that all what happens in Iraq is connected with what happens in Syria and in the whole region. We can't really deny this connection in today's world reality. But there are some local facts which all these groups could benefit or could work on it or could manipulate. The corruption and the lack of services and unemployment is a real problem in Iraq. But who is trying to use this in its own benefit? We will see it within the upcoming days. But so far, the picture that we see that what happens in Iraq today is in the frame of the alliance that we see in Syria and in the region. So naturally, I think the U.S., Iran, Turkey will take their positions around this picture.
Right, but also in recent statements, Iran Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, he came out and he said that there were enemies trying to drive a wedge between Tehran and Baghdad.
Yes, if we go back what's happening in Iraq, we all know that Iran has its own agenda in Iraq and its own history, starting from the Iran-Iraq war. And America and all the other countries, they have their own agenda. But in this specific demonstrations which took place within the last 5-6 days, that specifically created a new environment. And we see that the government started to use a language saying that this is a conspiracy against our government. And despite the calls from the opposition parties or the leading list at the Iraqi parliament for an early election or the resignation of the government gives the message that they are standing strong, they are an elected government, and they will continue to work for the benefit of the Iraqi citizens. And those who want to create chaos through streets or through possible coup even, they will face the government's determined acts, they say. So it came to a point that the government is insisting in continuing in their power, but we don't know yet what will the response from the other side, because since there is no official statement yet.
Right. So while there are international events that are coinciding or going hand in hand in what is unfolding here in Iraq, Ms. Belkis Wille, coming back to you, we were talking about saboteurs that even the Iraqi authorities have talked about, the snipers that you mentioned, that there are saboteurs within our groups who are targeting protesters. And now, earlier today, we heard the Iraqi military coming out and saying that, yes, there has been the use of excessive force and that we will look into this and hold into account those behind those, the protests, 13 protesters who were killed in the districts of Baghdad. Do you feel that this statement is just a statement here to calm the situation down, or that there will be any accountability?
Unfortunately, there we really need to rely on Iraq's track record. After every major human rights scandal, whether it's protests or military operations, whenever it looks like civilians have been unlawfully targeted, the response of the government is to announce a commission to investigate, an investigative committee, any number of forms of, theoretically a group of people that are meant to have responsibility to investigate and to hold accountable where they find wrongdoing. In the history of Human Rights Watch working on and documenting abuses in Iraq, we have yet to see a single one of those committees ever coming out with public and transparent findings, holding individuals accountable who were found to have committed wrongdoings, and compensating victims. So it is very hard to take this statement to be more serious than previous ones. And unfortunately, I worry that we're going to yet again have the government simply glossing over this very painful period and not doing right by the protesters who've been unlawfully killed.
And Ms. Wille, with your understanding of what is happening on the ground, your communication with those out on the streets, is there a pattern evolving? Is this an unprecedented protest as compared to what happened earlier a year ago in Basra? Or do you feel like this movement, without its leadership, is striking out on its own?
I do think there are a lot of similarities. As you pointed out, there were in some cases, quite violent protests last summer in Basra. You've had cyclically violent protests breaking out in Baghdad, including 2 and 3 years ago. And the demands of the protests have really been the same over and over again. They are protests fundamentally about improved services and about curbing corruption. So I don't take this to be sort of a new phenomenon. I take this to be built very much on the backs of previous protests. The question is really, in this moment, in the sort of theoretically post-ISIS moment of Iraq with a new government in place, will they handle this fundamentally differently and fundamentally better? And there, unfortunately, the last few days of government response suggest that no, they are not going to behave any better than previous governments.
All right. It hasn't been any better than previous guys. There we had Ms. Belkis Wille and Mr. John Hasasu. Thank you to both of you for taking out the time and speaking to us here on Newswire. Unfortunately, we've run out of time here, but we will be seeing you tomorrow with more updates on the situation, not only just in Jammu and Kashmir, but also other conflict zones across the world. With that, it is goodbye from me and the team. We'll see you next time.